My name is Elizabeth Adeolu. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Edinburgh. My presentation today is going to be on the domino effect of language endangerment in Nigeria, case study of Ife, Yoruba, and English. A language is said to be endangered when it is on the path to extinction. Dolby estimates that 2,500 languages are likely to be lost in the present century. Worm 1998 presents 5 levels of language endangerment, showing varying degrees or stages on this path to extinction. So the first level is potentially endangered languages. And these are languages which are socially and economically disadvantaged under heavy pressure from a larger language and beginning to lose child speakers. Then there are endangered languages which have few or no children learning the language, and the youngest good speakers are young adults. There are also seriously endangered languages which have the youngest good speakers aged 50 or older. And then the fourth level is moribund languages which have only a handful of good speakers left, mostly very old. And finally, extinct languages which have no speakers left. According to UNESCO experts, 9 factors are to be considered in evaluating endangerment. These are intergenerational language transmission, absolute number of speakers, proportion of speakers within total population, trends in existing language domains, response to new domains and media, materials for language education and literacy, governmental and institutional language attitudes and policies, including official status in use, community members' attitudes towards their own language, amount and quality of documentation. They also added that no single factor, so no single one of these factors can be used in assessing a language's vitality or its need for documentation. A language that is ranked highly according to one criterion may deserve urgent attention due to other factors. One thing is clear, though, when languages are being endangered, this is not happening in a vacuum. So when one language is being endangered, it is being replaced by another. Endangerment studies have focused on minority varieties giving way to majority varieties. So this is whether the majority variety is indigenous or non-indigenous. So the non-indigenous official languages that are usually focused on in endangerment studies are languages such as English, French, or Spanish. In Nigeria, the pattern has been minority indigenous languages giving way to majority indigenous languages. So an example would be Arigidi in southwestern Nigeria giving way to Yoruba, also in southwestern Nigeria, according to Oshodi, the Oshodi study 2011. Another pattern as well, apart from minority indigenous languages giving way to majority indigenous languages, would be majority indigenous languages in Nigeria seem to be giving way to the non-indigenous official language, which is English. And so you have studies which have looked at indigenous majority languages like Igbo and Yoruba giving way to English. Generally, though, there are over 400 languages spoken in Nigeria. At least 390 of these are minority languages or varieties. These varieties usually do not have a clear variety definition, so they do not normally have an official status as languages or dialects. They also are usually not standardized, so they have no orthography. And most of the time as well, they're lumped with majority languages in their region. So one example would be the case of the Arigidi study by Oshodi 2011, where Arigidi, even though it has certain linguistic nuances because of its similarity to Yoruba, is usually actually classed as a dialect of Yoruba, even though it's seen by some as a language in its own right. So the current study will investigate the domino effect of language endangerment in Nigeria. That is minority indigenous, a minority indigenous language variety giving way to a majority indigenous language, which in turn is giving way to the non-indigenous official language variety. So this would be, again, as I said, case study of Ife, which is the minority indigenous language, seem to be giving way to the majority indigenous language, which is Yoruba, which is in turn giving way to the non-indigenous official variety, which in this case is English. Focus will be on how variety definition for minority indigenous varieties affects language endangerment. All right, so the language varieties in focus. There is English, which is the official language in Nigeria. It's used in formal domains, and even now it's used as a first language by many speakers, spoken currently by over 75 million people in Nigeria. And it is again being used in not just formal domains actually, but in informal domains as well. And then the second language in focus is Yoruba. Is one of three majority languages in Nigeria, officially recognized majority languages in Nigeria. It's largely spoken in southwestern Nigeria by over 20 million people. It seems to be endangered due to dwindling intergenerational transmission, lack of use in all domains, especially in education, and then relatively less positive attitudes in comparison with English by speakers. And finally, there's Ife, which is an indigenous minority variety spoken largely in Western Kogi State, which is in the Middle Belt region of Nigeria. So Ife is actually an interesting one because it is seen as it doesn't have a determined status, so it doesn't have a definite definition. It's seen sometimes as a language in its own right, and then sometimes as a dialect of Yoruba, because it is similar to Yoruba in some certain linguistic respects. And sometimes as well, it's seen as a dialect of what is called Okun language. So there are a number of Yoruboid varieties that are spoken in Kogi State that are sometimes referred to as Okun languages. Okun languages are also not defined. So sometimes they're referred to as Yoruba, erroneously, because they are distinct from Yoruba, but they're referred to as a form of Yoruba, so dialects of Yoruba. And then sometimes as well, they're referred to as distinct language in their own right. But the Ife variety is spoken by over 100,000 people. But like most minority varieties in Nigeria, it's not standardized. It's not defined as well in terms of what it is as a variety. So these are the research questions I have for the current study. So while other studies are focused on the 9-point factors in determining language endangerment, the current study has uncovered another factor that ought to be considered in assessing language endangerment in multilingual settings like Nigeria, and that's variety definition. So the research questions in this line are: is there a domino effect of language endangerment in Nigeria? And how does variety definition affect this pattern of language endangerment? So the methodology used is what's presented here very briefly. So the participants were 20 Yoruba speaking participants and 20 Ife speaking participants who were ethnically Yoruba and ethnically Ife. And the instrument used was a questionnaire, which was then quantitatively and qualitatively analyzed. So these are the results. So as expected, is the relevant results for the purpose of this presentation. As expected, positive attitudes towards English vis-a-vis Yoruba by Yoruba participants was what the study found. 60% of the Yoruba participants said English was more important than Yoruba. And then there was a positive attitude towards English and Yoruba vis-a-vis Ife. So 80% of the Ife participants said English and Yoruba were more important than Ife. 70% of Yoruba participants said that Yoruba was being endangered by English, but only 35% of Ife participants said that Ife was giving way to Yoruba. Uh, However, 78% of the Ife participants state that Ife was giving way to English. So, is there a domino effect of language endangerment? And I've put here a resounding yes. So, Ife speakers state that they use Yoruba in domains where they could use Ife. So, that would be in informal conversations with friends and family, even as a home language, instead of some of them mentioned English, but if they didn't mention English, then they mentioned Yoruba before mentioning Ife. Also, the Ife participants rate Yoruba higher than Ife, both for instrumental as well as integrative roles and reasons. However, as has been stated before, majority of the Ife respondents states that Ife is not giving way to Yoruba, but rather to English because they believe that Ife was a dialect of Yoruba. So there were comments like these. So there was somebody said, Ife is a fragment of Yoruba. An average Ife man can speak Yoruba. Somebody else said that Ife was not being endangered by Yoruba because of similarities between both varieties. And about 3 or 4 people mentioned in response to the question about whether Ife was giving way to Yoruba, that it was a no because it is. So that's Ife is a dialect of Yoruba. However, I've said here that however, this is not so straightforward. So in response to the question about whether Ife was a dialect of Yoruba, so that was a direct question asking that, 17 of the 20 Ife participants said yes, that Ife was a dialect of Yoruba. 10 of the 20 participants said it was a language on its own and it wasn't a dialect of Yoruba. And one said it belonged to another group of languages. They didn't actually state which, but presumably Okun. Presumably. All right. So that response, like I said, is not so straightforward because there are 20 Ife participants. So some have actually mentioned, or majority of them have said Ife is a dialect of Yoruba, but then 10 of them have said it's the language on its own. So there seems to be some contradiction going on. So some people have said yes and no because they probably are not sure whether it's a dialect or a language on its own. And like I said before, there are a number of reasons why this might be the case. There are very different views on the language, but all in all, there's no clear variety definition for that. So it's not clear whether it's a dialect or whether it's a language on its own. And again, like I said before, some of at least one of them have mentioned similarities between both, but then even in other in answering other questions as well on the questionnaire, many of the participants, the Ife participants, have mentioned the similarities between both languages, both varieties. And even though mutual intelligibility has been suggested as the major determining factor in differentiating between a language and a dialect, there are certain cases that have made this factor, so mutual intelligibility, almost irrelevant. So Gompas's 1982 lists some examples to support this notion. So he mentioned Hindu and Urdu in India, Serbian and Croatian in Yugoslavia of that date, Fanti and Twi in Ghana. There's Bokmal and Nynorsk in Norway. And all of these languages are mutually intelligible, but they're still seen as, they're not seen as dialects of the other one language is not seen as, or one variety is not seen as a dialect of the other, in spite of the mutual intelligibility. And so this made Gompers conclude that social historical factors play a crucial role in determining boundaries. And so Wardle 2010 also suggests that the presence or lack of language or dialect dichotomy could also be established by the need for a separate or a unified identity, which are motivated by political and religious reasons. And so that appears to be the case as well with Ife dialect, and probably arguably with a lot of minority varieties in Nigeria. Um, so the fact that, for instance, and this was mentioned several times, the fact that Yoruba was actually used in religious settings, and the fact that it was the standard version of, say, things like the Bible. So the orthography of the Bible was in Yoruba for Ife speakers, and that was sort of an indigenous language of religion as well, apart from English. Made it seem as if Yoruba was obviously more important and probably very more culturally relevant for Ife people than Ife itself was. But overall, it is difficult to determine whether Ife is a language or a dialect, and this is perhaps why it is particularly relevant to the current study. And so I've said, just in conclusion, that given all the factors that have been stated to determine language endangerment, the current study has shown that variety definition can contribute to language endangerment in multilingual settings like Nigeria. The speakers of minority varieties with no determinate definition, such as Ife, might have their language endangered by a major indigenous language, such as Yoruba, and not see this as endangerment because they consider their variety to be a dialect of the majority language, even though it is linguistically distinct, or there are some linguistic nuances from that majority language. Future research in this field should take this factor into account in carrying out research on endangerment in multilingual settings like Nigeria. And these are the references. Thank you.